Giorgio Vacchiano from University of Milan. I'll be the moderator of the first session in the morning that has to do with growing resilient and climate-smart alpine forests. So without further ado, let me introduce Marco Onida, the team leader forests from DG Environment at the European Commission's, talking remotely, I believe, from Brussels. Marco, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I hope you see my screen.
We do.
Okay. So thank you very much. This is actually an honor and a great opportunity for me to say a few words about the new EU forest strategy, and in particular with the relevance for alpine forests. I've been dealing a lot with alpine forests in one of my previous lives, so it's also very good to see among the panelists some of old friends that I haven't seen for a long time. So when I have 8 minutes, I will go very fast in introducing the new EU forest strategy. What is this EU forest strategy for 2030? This is actually the policy document that sets the scene for the action of the EU on forest. People might think that forest is not an EU competence. It is actually. Forest is a shared competence between the EU and the member states, because forest touches at the heart of several policies which are fully in the prerogatives of the EU, like environment and climate, for instance. This forest strategy is the result of a complex and joint work, in particular by three co-leading departments within the European Commission: DG Environment, DG Climate Action, and DG Agriculture, with, of course, the contribution of many other services. It is not the first strategy we have. We have strategies on forest and forestry in the EU since late 70s, but it's actually the first one which is in the context of a complete new approach, which is the approach of the Green Deal. Now, let me see if I can make this in full screen. And yep. So this is actually a flagship initiative of the European Green Deal. You know, the European Green Deal is actually the first priority of the European Commission led by President von der Leyen. It calls for a higher biodiversity and climate ambition in line with the expectation of people. We have put forests in the last years really at their heart. We see an enormous change compared to the past, and the importance of political importance of forests. We are flooded with requests and letters by people to protect forests, plant trees, and so on. So the new forest strategy builds on this new ambition of the Green Deal and its deliverables, among others, the new biodiversity strategy that was adopted in May 2020 for biodiversity in general, and already setting out some policy objectives on forests, and then the forest strategy builds further on that. Now, very, very briefly, if I manage to go ahead with the slides, it doesn't seem, here we go. Okay, what is at the core of the EU forest strategy? Actually, the key word here is multifunctionality. The multifunctional role of forests, economic, social, and environmental function of forests, contribution of forests to the value-based chain for achieving a sustainable, climate-neutral, and biodiversity rich economy by 2050. Then ensuring that the forest ecosystems are restored, resilient, and adequately protected. We have a situation of European forests which is not particularly satisfactory, with about 3/4 of EU forests not in a good status of conservation, particularly for those which are falling under the Natura 2000 legislation. And then an adequate forest monitoring and strategic planning for the future. I'll say a couple of words on each of these pillars without going too much into the details for reasons of time, but of course I will then share for those who want the slides later. So the socioeconomic pillar contains 4 main objectives: the promotion of the sustainable forest bioeconomy, in particular with the promotion of long-lived wood products, because compared to the short-lived products are those, of course, where carbon can remain the longest possible in the products not being released in the atmosphere. The contrary that what happens when, of course, we burn wood for bioenergy, which is an important source of renewable energy, but it's also this, at the core of a quite big controversy today, or whether it's really renewable, and in particular whether it's really sustainable. The European Union is of the opinion that it is, but of course it committed to work further on improving the sustainability criteria enshrined into legislation on the use of bioenergy. Then very important, wood, but not just wood, also the promotion of revenue from the so-called non-wood forest-based bioeconomy, including ecotourism, which is crucial, particular for the alpine forest and not only. Then a whole set of measures on improving the skills, education, and everything which is related to learning how to deal with forests and forest resilience in the future. In the slides, you will see all the details, which I have no time to go through now, but this is basically the detail of what I just said. Now, the environmental pillar requests to protect the last remaining primary and old growth forests, only about 3% of EU forests today. So strict protection of these forests is requested by the biodiversity strategy, ensuring that forests are managed in a possibly in a way which is closer to nature. So promoting forestry practices which are more prone to biodiversity, climate, and mimicking nature. Enlarging European forests, in particular with reforestation of biodiverse forests, and the pledge to plant 3 billion additional trees by 2030, with the principle of planting the right tree in the right place at the right moment. And then a whole set of measures to financial incentives, concerning financial incentives, how to better use EU funding, develop a payment for ecosystem service schemes, and so on. Again, here you will see a number of deliverables. In particular, we will work on further improving the indicators for sustainable forest management. We will work on closer to nature forest practices and voluntary certification of these practices. No time to go into detail now, but you will see all this. And then on the financial incentives, as I said, better uptake of the funds, use of payment for ecosystem services, in particular within the Common Agricultural Policy, but also other European funds. We're going to launch a LIFE project on payment for ecosystem services, and so on and so forth. Very important is monitoring of forests, because today one of the conclusions of the forest strategy is that we have a lot of data, but these data are not necessarily consistent among member states. They are a bit patchy. They are also, there is a need to better integrate data collected on the ground with remote sensing data and so on. So the European Union has decided to launch an initiative, a legislative initiative in 2023 to, prior to an impact assessment, to improve the monitoring of forests by having a regulation or a directive, we will see, on forest monitoring, data collection and reporting system, which will also touch about the so-called strategic planning of forests. And then there are a few enabling aspects like research, governance, dialogue between the words that are relevant for forests, and so on and so forth, and then stepping up the implementation and enforcement of EU acquis, because we still have also a problem of illegal logging in the EU, in particular in the eastern countries. These are also alpine forests in the Carpathian, particularly in Romania and in Slovakia. We had a few issues with EU infringements which are ongoing. Now, just to conclude, it's very interesting to compare this EU forest strategy with the mountain forest protocol of the Alpine Convention. So I say this because we're talking about climate smart, and we should also say biodiversity smart alpine forests. In 1996, the 8 countries of the Alpine Convention adopted a legally binding agreement, a protocol, which is ratified by these states. And it's a protocol of mountain forests of the Alpine Convention, which is very interesting because it's 1996, but it contains many of the aspects that you find in the new strategy for the European Union. So it's interesting to see that we were in the Alps. People were kind of anticipating this multifunctional approach: protection, biodiversity, climate, and so on. So with this,
Marco, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. In the interest of time, we really need you to wrap up. So maybe if you can give some final message. Thank you.
That was my final message. I come to the end. I was about just to wish you a good continuation of the work, and thank you for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco Onida, Team Leader Forests from DGMB. So after this very good introduction, I think we need some scene setting. So let me introduce two distinguished speakers. First of all, Professor Matthias Rotak from University of Innsbruck, who will speak about climate change in mountainous areas. Matthias, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giorgio, for the introduction. And so I see how I do this with the advancing the slides. So yes, sort of going back a little bit from the forests to the background, why it is all the question and what we do. I'd like to speak a little bit about climate, about the atmosphere in mountainous areas. As I've been introduced, I'm a professor for dynamic meteorology, so for atmospheric processes at the University of Innsbruck. You can see in the background of this figure or this picture that we are in the middle of the mountains, and of course we are interested in what the mountains do to the atmosphere. I was asked to setting the scene here, and I'm trying to do that. I see that the title towards climate smart alpine forests is got a little small, but anyway, so you can, I mean, you all know that in here. If it comes to climate change, it is clear, and I've just learned, I'm preaching to the convinced in your introduction. I mean, everybody knows it's a reality. In 2021, this was a year of many different aspects with respect to climate change. The new IPCC report was released, and on the road towards COP26, every crossing, so to say, has a new event there to remind us that it's really important and that we need to do something. Nevertheless, maybe as a climate scientist, I should say that from my point of view, Paris is hardly reachable in the sense, yes, in the IPCC report it says technically it's going to be reachable, but we would have to do enormous changes to basically all what we need to do, what we want to do. And of course we are all invited, we are urged actually to do whatever we can to reduce those carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. But nevertheless, aside, we also do have to think of adaptation strategies and what to do. And forests, of course, we have heard it also in the two introductions here. They are an essential pathway or means to actually do that. Now, you all know that mountain areas are quite sensitive to climate change. We have realized already about the double of what the rest of the world has experienced. It's composed of fragile ecosystems. Forests are among them, and forests, of course, are one of the most important of those services to society that the mountains can offer. And there is a list of some others there too. Mountains do not only have a strong sensitivity to climate or to weather and climate. In that sense, they're also producing their own climate. So you all know that mountains are producing precipitation, for instance, what we then call orographic precipitation. They produce storms. We have heard about this storm just recently, and mountain windstorms or other atmospheric phenomena. When it comes to make a prediction, and that's what the forest community, but not only the forest community, the society in general expects from us, from the atmospheric science community, when it comes to make predictions, scenarios, how is the climate that we expect going to be. First of all, we need to measure. Now, in the mountains, it's a little more difficult to put up a weather station or a climate station, a monitoring station. Nevertheless, we need it to validate our models. And what it means is that all what we say is based on more sparse observations than we would wish, to say the least. Now, there is one more issue, and this is if we want to say something about the future, we need models. We cannot measure the future now, so we need to do that through big computers, so we are using among the biggest computers in the world to do those simulations for climate scenarios and future states of the atmosphere. And they have, and I have to make a very, very short crash course, so to say, on climate modeling. They have an issue, of course, in the mountains too. You know, maybe, or hopefully, that when modeling the atmosphere, this is no statistical models as other sectors do, so this is physical modeling. So we are covering the whole atmosphere with grid boxes, and in each grid box we solve some physical processes, mathematically expressed somehow, and it's based on first principles like conservation of energy or mass or so. So it's this is a huge job on the computer, and that's an issue which basically says something about what resolution, how big those grid boxes can be, what resolution is. And for regional climate predictions and scenarios, we are at the moment at about 10 kilometers. That's pretty much, if you have ever hiked in the mountains, in the forest or out of the forest. So you know that when you're in the forest and it takes 10 kilometers to be out of the forest, that's all the same grid box. And you know that the climate is maybe not exactly the same in and out of the forest. So that's an issue what we have to sort of take into account. I'm not going to give you a wrap up on climate predictions or so, just to say, due to this computing problems, despite using the biggest computers, we do have to do some what is called pseudo global warming. That's pretty much accepted in the community, and this then produces plots like this. What you see here is annual precipitation. I don't, oh, that's not possible to use a pointer here. The lower row is well, what the community uses, 12 kilometer, 2 kilometer. In the upper row is what we think is appropriate for climate in the mountains. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going into the details here. We would see that the south is going to be drier and the north is going to be wetter and all that. The only point I want to make here is that you see these three panels, and it's kind of difficult to read because somehow my correction to the plots are buried. In the left-hand plot, you see the Alps. In the middle, you see the British Isles. I thought, as a guest of the British Embassy, I would use that. And to the right, it would be the Mediterranean, because we're in the Mediterranean. And you always see two red lines. One is a dashed line, one is a full line. And the point I want to make is that this dashed line and the full line, they are farthest apart. They are apart by a factor of 2 or so on the left-hand panel, which is the panel for the Alps. So the high resolution is shown here on this figure to be most relevant, most important, and game changer, so to say, if we are dealing with the Alps. Now, if it comes to the forest, of course, the question is it only temperature and precipitation, what we usually provide, or is it maybe other, and we have heard already that there are other players in the game, like the pests and so on, so they might have different climatic response factors. It's not so very clear whether we really know them, whether we have the data. I mean the atmospheric science community, the forest community has probably the data there too. This is just to say that this is a little commercial for a international research program which is called Team X, and I happen to be the chairman of this, and it's probably the reason why I'm here. So this is embedded in sort of all sorts of international bodies like the World Meteorological Organization and Met and Hydrological Services and universities and all that. basically, and that's less than a nutshell, so to say, we want to better understand these processes in the mountains, we want to better model them, and we want to get more data and better data, of course. And all this is with the goal to provide better information to communities like the forest community in order to handle the topic of smart alpine forests. So there's 2 points that I wanted to make. I'm already there, so that's my last slide. I've tried to make up some time here. So when it comes to planning for climate smart alpine forests, so I think that it is relevant to notice from a climate perspective or from an atmospheric perspective that it requires climate information at its most difficult. So where it is most difficult to get this information, that's what the alpine forests need to be informed upon. So that's the first part, and the second one, it possibly, that's what I want to learn also today, it's possibly requiring information on variables that we are not even thinking of in the atmospheric community. I have been involved in a program or in a project actually to deal with apple pest, which is very different. But anyway, so these colleagues, the biologists who did those investigations, they came with sort of, they wanted to have the lower part of the leaves temperature, not just the air temperature, but the and so we were like trying to figure out what actually, how we could estimate that from the modeled information we have. So that's just the first point. So it's most difficult to get the required information in the Alps, and what I think is really essential is that international collaboration is really at the center of this part, and that's not only for the forests. That's only for the forests when we are here today. I think another event was for the smart cities, and it's exactly the same. So this, it is very important to collaborate in a broader sense, and that's I have briefly introduced this TeamX program, but there is of course a large number of international programs and bodies that do this. Okay, so I hope that the scene is set, and I've saved some, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope to learn more on the forest side in what comes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias, for the insightful presentation, and also for saving some time so we can have a more relaxed ongoing of our works. Let me remind to all the people that are following this seminar remotely that they can ask questions using the chat window, I believe, in the online interface. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the first part of the morning, so we will pick up the most interesting questions and ask our panelists for answers. The scene is set, but so now our question is, should we worry about mountain forest in a rapidly changing world? And that's exactly the title of the presentation by our next speaker, Professor Harald Bugmann from ETH Zurich. And Harald, if you're connected, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, Giorgio, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm running the risk of repeating some things, but I try to point out new aspects of things that have been mentioned already by Matthias and also in the introductory speeches. I would like to remind ourselves very briefly of the very high importance of mountains and mountain forests in the context of ecosystem services. In terms of carbon storage and as a resource base, mountain forests are quite important, and as a resource base, you see the mushrooms there at the bottom, or game, or medicinal plants, or herbs. They're very important in a developing country context still today, and this is something that we tend to forget from a European perspective. From a conservation biodiversity point of view, we tend to ignore, or we tend to neglect that forests are very important for some very specific groups, not only for the animals and the lichens and ferns as shown on these two pictures, but particularly also for insects and for fungi. The key word there is deadwood, and deadwood as a habitat for many, many species, many of which are not even known at this point. Then Matthias has already mentioned the water cycle and the importance of mountains for changing the water cycle, for harvesting the precipitation from the atmosphere. I would like to point out that mountain forests, because of their much deeper rooting zone than grassland systems and herbaceous systems, they have a very strong role in moderating the flow of water from the mountains downstream, and in that context also, for example, the mitigation of flooding. And there were, with natural hazards, of course, now I'm really preaching to the converted already. Mountain forests are very important to keep the soil in place, to avoid that everything is going down the drain, literally speaking. And if we don't have forests, then we need to put up artificial protection measures, as you can see them here, for keeping the snow in place and avoiding avalanches. And lastly, the whole recreation and tourism aspects are very important as well, and forests can provide multiple incentives there to keep the population of the mountain areas themselves, and also those who are coming from remote, to keep them happy and to give them a good spirit and a good attitude towards life. Let me just remind you that about a quarter of the whole terrestrial area of this globe is mountainous, and mountain forests cover more than a quarter, cover 28% of the world forest area. So the mountain area has a particular responsibility for the forests in their territory. Now, let's look a little bit at the past. We have reconstructed forest dynamics quite some time ago for one particular valley in Switzerland over time. And we started with what we call a zero management scenario, which actually is not quite realistic, but then we adopted a historical harvesting regime based on old records. And what you see is a strong decrease of biomass over a couple of centuries until the forest protection law entered into force at around 1900. And then we have the current harvesting regime, which was entering into force after the forest law, and you see a strong recovery of biomass until about today. Now, on the one hand, we see this strong decrease of biomass of carbon storage, and then the recovery. We're now at around 2010, and we are now exploiting the fact that we have an increase, a recovery of the biomass from the historical overexploitation as a contribution towards our national carbon balances. This is happening in many countries. However, let me emphasize that in the longer run, this overshoot will be gone, and we will be more or less back to the carbon storage above ground where we are now. The other point I want to make here is that if you just change the time scale, you can easily see where we are in a developing country context. So the forest transition has happened in developed countries like Switzerland, but we're about to reach it sooner or later in a developing country context. So if we use mountain forests and their recovery now to help us achieve emission reduction targets, this is just exploring or exploiting the crimes of the past, so to speak. And we could have an ethical discussion about whether this is legitimate or whether we should try to avoid the emissions at the source and not via biotic measures. Matthias has already mentioned it. This is the temperature curve of Switzerland, the aerial average. Since the beginning of the measurements in 1864, we have an increase of about 1.5 to 2 degrees. So this is twice the global average. So it's clearly established and meanwhile also physically understood why mountain regions are particularly sensitive to human-induced climate change, and that we are suffering from about twice the increase of the temperature. Precipitation predictions are much more difficult. Matthias has explained that, so I'm not going to go into any of the details there. Now, in the past, humans have had a huge impact on mountain forests, and what we are seeing now are changes to mountain forests in the current era. And I'm going to point out 3 examples. One is changes at the leading edge. changes at the trailing edge where the forest is giving way to grasslands at the lower edge of the mountains. And then we also are witnessing increasingly changes within the forested area of mountains. Changes at the upper forest edge. There's a meta-analysis from the year 2009 that examined changes to upper tree line. The black dots are points or tree lines where there was an upward movement. The gray dots are points where there was no upward movement. There was no downward movement globally of any tree line that was studied in this context. And we see that, for example, in the European mountains in Switzerland, that we have an upward movement of the tree line. This is an example from the Surselva region in Switzerland, where we had a wave of establishment after about 1960, 1965, until 1985, until all spots that are available for regeneration had been occupied, and now the forest is growing further upslope. Very slowly, so we have huge lag effects. It will take a long time for this response to actually unfold fully, but we are seeing the first signs. 20 years ago, we have here an autumn picture from the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. It looks as if the trees are losing their foliage, as they do in every year, but unfortunately this is an evergreen system. So this is the pinon pine that started to die in October 2002, and in May 2004, that same system looked like this. So basically all the pinon pines in that landscape were wiped out, over 10,000 square kilometers of forest. This is a massive dieback event, the first that was documented in recent time. There were earlier ones, but this is the first one that was documented after, well, the onset of anthropogenic global change. And now within the forested area, to our big surprise, in summer of 2018 in the Swiss Alps, we saw pictures like that, where all of a sudden the beaches turned brown in the middle of summer. This was in August 2018. And shortly thereafter, we started to have massive impacts of bark beetles, particularly, of course, on spruces of the Ips typographus in the Czech Republic. 25 million square cubic meters of trees were killed. Then we have the same thing in Lower Austria. We had the same thing also in southern Germany. So now the climate change has triggered trees to become more susceptible to biotic agents, and the biotic agents have started to do that with massive consequences. What will happen in the future, or what could happen in the future? I'm showing you a few examples here from a study that we did for representative stand types of the current forests in Switzerland that we used as a starting point. So this is the 0 point here. And we calculated the fate of these forests into the future until the year 2200. And what we're looking at here is the change in basal area compared to the current situation. And basal area, you can think of that as tree volume or biomass as well. And we did that for many, many different elevational zones in Switzerland, from low elevation to the uppermost forests at upper tree line. For soils with a high soil water holding capacity, so rich soils versus poor soils. And we looked at 3 different climate scenarios. They're labeled here in a strange way. The blue one is basically an RCP 2.6. Then the green one is an RCP 4.5, and the orange one is an RCP 8.5. And then we also looked at the uncertainty within the models anyway. And what you see is that for some systems on rich soil, where the trees are adapted to dry and hot conditions already, not very much is happening. You see that at the highest elevations, you tend to have a positive response on rich soils. And then in between, there's sometimes very massive negative responses, particularly under the strong climatic change. And on poor soils, you even at the highest elevations get a strong, get a bounce back to the current conditions, or get the negative signal of drought. And in the subalpine zone here, it's become much more negative on poor soils. This is the setting when you do continue the current management and you do not do any planting of tree species. Then the impact depends very strongly on the scenario, on the elevation, and on the soil. And we get increasingly negative impacts at low elevations. And most of the negative changes unfold until the year 2100. You're always there with the lowest point. So it doesn't take centuries, but it takes many decades until we get the negative responses. Now, if we take into account that we may plant species, we may do assisted migration, and species may also migrate themselves, you see in a nutshell that the response is either more positive in the highest elevations or less negative in the lower elevations compared to the non-migration, non-planting situation. So basically, management matters as well. So climate change is very important. The species choice is very important. The elevation matters, the contextual setting of the forests, and we can do a lot by managing these forests in a forward-looking manner. So we can compensate to a certain extent by the management for the negative impacts of climate change. And this brings me to the question, well, very nice, we have these predictions, if you want to call them predictions, will this actually happen? And we've seen in the past, like in the Western US, that something happened that we did not take into account before. Everybody was quite surprised that this massive mortality wave happened. We have wind throw events, which before 1990 were not on the radar of people in Central Europe, for example. We have wildfires. The Mediterranean fires of this summer have been mentioned. If you look at California, it's becoming more and more dramatic. So these are things that will trigger very fast changes that are not the same as the ones that I've shown on the previous slide, which are the chronic responses to chronic climatic change. And then we have other things like the insects that I've shown already, or new species coming in, invasives like the tree of heaven, or invasive insects like the Asian longhorn beetle, which can have the potential to wipe out species or to change biodiversity quite strongly. So, to sum up, I hope to have shown you that mountain forests are highly relevant from global to local scales. They're also highly sensitive to environmental change because of the disproportionately high rates of warming at high elevations. The land use legacies, which often, this regrowth since the 19th century often leads to highly artificial stand structures today, which are prone to biotic agents, which are also prone to abiotic agents like windstorms. And climate change will induce and is about to induce the strongest equilibrium between forest state and its driving force, that is the climate. Mountain forests start to be on the move. It's not that we have to wait longer to see the response to global change. It happens at upper tree line, it happens at lower tree line, and we even see changes within the forest area in the mountains. We have a strong and a highly variable further response of mountain forests to climate change, but we cannot make sweeping statements about this is what will happen to mountain forests. It really depends on the location in environmental space, and it will also depend on the extent of climate change and on management. Then there are non-linearities, extreme events that will lead to tipping points, which will strongly shape the future, and we must take those into account in the science and also in the practical management. So yes, we should worry. And with that, I'd like to finish and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Harald.